At my daughter's trial, the air was thick with whispers. When I walked into the courtroom, my daughter smirked, and her husband shook his head in quiet disbelief. They thought I didn't belong here, that the frail old woman standing at the back was out of her depth. I simply adjusted my shawl and walked forward. The sound of my shoes against the marble floor echoed through the silence. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and tell me the city you're watching from. I'd love to know how far my truth travels. I've always believed that families should stand by each other, no matter what. That belief was the foundation of my entire life. My late husband Robert used to say, "Alice, you have the rare gift of seeing good in people." I carried that faith with me for 70 years, until the day I realized my daughter had learned to use that goodness against me. The courtroom was elegant, oak benches polished to a shine, the flag hanging perfectly behind the judge's seat, sunlight cutting in slanted beams through tall windows. Yet everything felt cold. My daughter, Grace, sat at the plaintiff's table in her navy suit, her posture perfect. She looked like a stranger wearing my child's face. Beside her, her husband, Matthew, leaned in and whispered something that made her lips curl into that same smirk I'd seen when she was 16 and got away with a lie. I took my place quietly in the defendant's chair. The same woman who had once braided Grace's hair before school now sat accused of forging her own husband's will. According to Grace, I had manipulated a dying man into leaving me everything. The house, the shares, the inheritance she claimed was rightfully hers. The irony was almost poetic. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes, adjusted his glasses as the court clerk called for order. He looked at me for a moment, his expression unreadable. I could feel every gaze in the room pressing against me, waiting to see how the fragile widow would crumble. But I didn't crumble. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. Grace's lawyer began his statement. His words were rehearsed, dripping with sympathy for my confused mental state. According to their version, I was a lonely woman who didn't understand what I was signing, a victim of her own misunderstanding. Matthew nodded along, playing the part of the concerned son-in-law. My mind wandered as he spoke, drifting back to a different courtroom 25 years ago. One I had stood in beside Robert, back when our company was fighting to keep control from aggressive investors. I remembered the same smell of polished wood and paper, the same hum of tension. Back then, the judge had looked at us with respect. Today, my own daughter looked at me with disgust. When Grace's attorney finished, I noticed she wouldn't meet my eyes. Maybe she couldn't. I had given her everything, her education, her wedding, even the down payment for her first home. Robert and I never said no to her, and now here she was saying I'd stolen what was hers. The judge finally turned toward me. "Mrs. Edwards," he said, his voice calm but curious, "do you understand the charges being brought against you?" I nodded once. "I do, Your Honor." "And how do you plead?" I looked directly at my daughter before answering. "Not guilty." A flicker of irritation passed across her face, a micro-expression only a mother would notice. She wasn't expecting composure, she wanted shame. The judge leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing, as though something about me was familiar. He studied my face, the way my hands rested steadily on the table. "Forgive me," he said after a pause, "but have we met before?" Grace stiffened beside her lawyer. "Your Honor, with respect, my mother." He raised a hand to silence her. "No. I remember now." His tone shifted, softer, almost reverent. "Alice Edwards, you testified in the Crawford case, didn't you? The patent dispute. Your testimony saved dozens of employees from losing their pensions." The courtroom went silent. My daughter's smile faltered. "Yes," I said simply. "That was me." Grace's lawyer cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I don't see how that's relevant." But it was relevant. In that single moment, the balance in the room shifted. The woman they thought was weak, confused, easily manipulated, had just been recognized by the same court as a brilliant, capable witness from a landmark case. Grace's face flushed pink. Matthew leaned forward, whispering harshly, "What is he talking about?" I looked at both of them, my voice calm, almost tender. "You thought I was just a housewife," I said. "But before you were born, I built a company beside your father. I fought in rooms like this long before you ever stepped into one." The judge adjusted his papers, clearly intrigued now. "Let's proceed," he said, "but I believe this case just became more interesting. As the gavel struck once, I sat a little taller. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt the faint warmth of his pride again. They thought I was finished. They were wrong. The next morning I woke up before the sun. The house felt too big again, like every room was holding its breath. I made coffee the way Robert used to, 2 spoons of sugar, a little cream, and sat by the window, watching the mist roll across the empty driveway. My reflection in the glass looked older than I remembered. Maybe because yesterday had taken more out of me than I wanted to admit. The newspaper was already at the door. I didn't have to open it to know what was inside. By noon, the story was everywhere. Daughter Sue's mother over millionaire's will. Grace's picture was on the front page, her chin tilted high, her hand clutching Matthew's arm. They looked proud. Victorious. The article barely mentioned me, just one line. The widow, 70 years old, appeared calm throughout the hearing. Calm. They had no idea how heavy that calm was. My phone rang all morning. Old friends, neighbors, even one of Robert's business partners from years ago. Everyone wanted to know if the rumors were true. I didn't answer a single call. Sometimes silence is the only dignity you have left. By afternoon, I walked through the study Robert and I used to share. Dust covered the old mahogany desk. The faint smell of his cologne still clung to the chair. I ran my fingers over the framed photo of our first factory, the one we built from nothing. Back then, we had no lawyers, no accountants, just faith and long nights. I smiled faintly. We were partners long before we were rich. When Robert died, I thought the hardest part would be sleeping alone. I was wrong. The hardest part was realizing how quickly people rewrite history when you're not there to defend it. Grace had been so different once. I can still see her as a child, bare feet running across the porch, her hair tangled in the summer wind. She used to bring me wildflowers and say, "You and Dad are the smartest people in the world." Somewhere between then and now, something changed. Maybe it was Matthew. Maybe it was money. Maybe both. The night before the next hearing, I went through Robert's safe. It hadn't been opened in years. Inside were folders, handwritten notes, and the original partnership agreement, the one with both our signatures. I ran my thumb along the edge of the paper. My name next to his. Clear and steady. The proof they claimed didn't exist. I could hear Robert's voice in my head. "Always keep a copy, Alice. People forget easily when money's involved." He'd said it like a joke back then. He hadn't known it would become a prophecy. When I arrived at the courthouse the next day, reporters lined the steps. Flashbulbs went off like fireworks. Someone shouted, "Mrs. Edwards, are you going to testify?" I didn't answer. I simply kept walking. The marble steps gleamed under the morning light. Inside, Grace was already seated, flipping through documents she didn't understand but pretended to. She looked up when I entered. That same smirk again. But this time her eyes flickered. Just a little. A shadow of doubt. The judge entered, his robe sweeping the floor. Court is now in session. Grace's lawyer started again, voice steady but sharper now. "Your Honor, we intend to show that Mrs. Edwards manipulated her late husband and falsified legal documents." He pointed toward me, then to the projected screen where an enlarged signature appeared. My signature. As you can see, this was added after the will was finalized. The ink differs. The judge raised a hand. "Mr. Collins, before you continue, I reviewed the background you submitted." He adjusted his glasses and looked at me. "Mrs. Edwards, your record shows decades of executive work in your husband's company. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied. Every figure, every deal, every signature went through both of us. Grace shifted in her seat. Matthew leaned closer, whispering something, but she didn't respond. The judge nodded slowly. "Interesting. Continue." They tried to rattle me. They brought up dates, bank statements, letters, anything they thought could make me falter. I didn't. I had lived every line of those documents. Every page was part of my life. When the opposing lawyer asked, "Mrs. Edwards, do you even remember signing these?" I looked straight at him and said, "I remember designing the logo on the top of that page." A ripple of laughter moved through the courtroom, soft but unmistakable. Even the judge smiled faintly before regaining his composure. Grace's face hardened. The smirk was gone. Hours passed. The air turned heavy. By the time the session ended, the silence in that room was different, no longer against me. It felt cautious, respectful. Outside, reporters crowded again, shouting questions. I said nothing. I didn't need to. My silence was starting to sound louder than their noise. That evening, back home, I placed the court transcript beside Robert's old photo. The sun was setting through the curtains, painting the room gold. I thought about how he used to say, "Truth always walks slower than lies, but it never loses its way." I smiled. The truth had finally caught up. Tomorrow, they would see what real forgery looked like. And it wouldn't be mine. The third day in court began with rain, the kind that made the windows blur and the marble floors shine like mirrors. I walked through the courthouse doors alone, the sound of rain following me like a quiet drumbeat. Grace and Matthew were already there, whispering to their lawyer, pretending not to notice me. They didn't offer a glance. I didn't need one. Inside, the air was cooler than usual. The judge's bench looked almost ghostly under the pale light. I took my seat, setting my bag on the table. The same bag I had carried for years, worn leather, scuffed edges, older than my daughter's marriage. Inside were the same papers that built our life, and the ones she said were lies. Grace's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, we'd like to present new evidence. A handwriting analysis." He handed a folder to the clerk, confident. I could almost hear Matthew exhale beside him. They believed they had won. The clerk passed the file to the judge, who flipped through the pages quietly. The only sound was the soft turning of paper. The judge looked up. "This report claims the signature was written by someone younger, more practiced, and emotionally detached." He raised an eyebrow. "Is that your expert opinion, Mr. Collins?" "Yes, Your Honor," the lawyer said proudly. "It proves Mrs. Edwards could not have signed the will. The style is inconsistent with a 70-year-old woman." A faint hum of laughter spread through the gallery. I smiled slightly. "May I see that?" I asked. The judge nodded. The clerk handed me the report. I scanned the lines slowly, letting each word settle. My hands didn't shake. They never did when the truth was close. When I looked up, the room had gone silent. "Mr. Collins," I said, "do you know how long I've been signing legal documents?" He hesitated. "That's not." 45 years, I interrupted softly. "I drafted, reviewed, and signed every merger Robert's company ever made. I wrote checks that paid your firm's invoices once, long before my husband died." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The lawyer's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry," I continued, still calm, "but if you believe a steady signature proves forgery, perhaps you've never met a woman who learned precision the hard way." The judge leaned back, trying not to smile. "Proceed," he said. Grace's face flushed red. She looked away, fiddling with her bracelet. Matthew whispered something again, but she didn't answer. The distance between them was starting to show. The next witness was called, an elderly man with silver hair and tired eyes. He shuffled to the stand with a cane. I recognized him immediately. Thomas Reed. He had worked with Robert and me from the beginning. "Mr. Reed," the lawyer said, "please tell the court your relationship to the late Mr. Edwards." He nodded. "Robert and I started in the same warehouse in the 70s, but it was Alice," he pointed toward me, "who ran the books. She was the one who kept us from losing everything in the first 2 years." A murmur again. Grace stiffened. The lawyer tried to interrupt. "Mr. Reed, please focus on the will." "I am," he said firmly. "Robert told me every month that he'd make sure Alice was taken care of. Said she'd earned every dollar twice over. He even told Grace once, but she didn't listen." The courtroom was silent. Grace's hands tightened in her lap. Her lawyer looked down at his notes, pretending to read. I could feel something changing, the weight of all their certainty starting to crack. When court adjourned for lunch, I walked past Grace without a word. Outside, reporters waited again, microphones ready. Someone asked, "Mrs. Edwards, how do you feel about your daughter's accusations?" I paused just long enough to meet their eyes. You can't accuse someone of stealing what she built herself. Then I walked on. Back home, the sky had cleared. The air smelled of wet grass and metal. I sat in the garden Robert loved, surrounded by the roses we planted 30 years ago. The petals were opening again after the rain. Nature didn't need permission to heal. I thought of Grace then, not as the woman sitting across from me in court, but as the little girl who used to hold my hand and promise she'd take care of me when I was old. Somewhere along the way, she'd forgotten that promise. Maybe I had, too. As evening fell, I opened the old partnership file again. There was one page Robert had never signed, a letter he wrote to Grace, sealed and dated 2 weeks before he died. I had found it the night before, but hadn't shown anyone. His handwriting was still firm. If you ever doubt your mother, remember she built everything with me. Without her, there would be nothing to inherit. I folded it back into the envelope and placed it inside my bag. I didn't know yet if I would use it in court, but I knew what it meant. That night, I sat by the window, listening to the rain start again. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, low and steady. Tomorrow would be the last day of the hearing. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Let them laugh again if they need to. I'm ready this time." The clock ticked softly beside me. The storm outside kept time with my heart. The final day began with the sound of wind against the courthouse doors. People filled the room earlier than usual, drawn by the whispers that the case would end today. I walked in last, the same slow, steady steps I'd taken every morning. Grace and Matthew were already seated, their faces pale beneath the courtroom lights. The confidence they wore like armor had cracked. I could see it in their posture, in the way Grace kept rubbing her fingers against each other, restless, anxious. The judge entered. Everyone rose. When we sat again, the silence felt heavier than before. I placed my bag on the table, the one that held Robert's letter, and folded my hands on top of it. Grace didn't look at me this time. "Your Honor," her lawyer began, voice dry, "the plaintiff would like to call one final witness." Grace's head lifted slightly, confused. The lawyer hesitated. "Actually, she insists on speaking for herself." The judge looked surprised. "Mrs. Collins, are you sure?" Grace nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, I just want to explain." She stood slowly, smoothing the wrinkles on her skirt. Her eyes darted around the room before settling on me. "I didn't want it to come to this," she said, her voice trembling. "But my father's will, it didn't make sense. My mother, she was never part of the business. She doesn't even know how it ran." Her words cut through the quiet like a thin blade. I didn't flinch. Grace continued, louder now. "All my life, I watched her cook, clean, play the perfect wife. I thought she was content. But after Dad died, she changed everything. She locked the office, moved his papers, refused to show me the will until it was too late." The judge glanced at me, then back at her. "Mrs. Collins, are you saying your mother falsified legal documents?" Grace hesitated. "I'm saying she couldn't have done this alone." It was Matthew who shifted first, his jaw tightening. "Grace," she turned sharply, "don't." The judge leaned forward. "You're under oath, Mrs. Collins. Did your mother alter the documents, or did you assume she did?" Grace's voice broke. "I assumed, because she's never." She stopped. "I don't know." The words hung in the air, trembling like loose wires. The judge nodded slowly. "Thank you. You may sit down." She did, her head bowed. For the first time I saw the little girl she once was, lost, scared, trying to fix something she didn't understand. The judge looked at me. "Mrs. Edwards, do you wish to respond?" I stood. My knees ached, but my voice didn't shake. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." I walked to the witness stand, my bag in hand. The clerk swore me in. The wooden seat creaked beneath me as I sat. "When my husband died," I began softly, "I didn't want anything except peace. We built everything together. The company, the home, the life Grace grew up in. But when people see an old woman living alone, they assume she's weak, that she doesn't understand the numbers written in ink decades ago." I opened the envelope and placed the folded paper on the desk. "This letter was written by my husband 2 weeks before he passed. It's addressed to our daughter." The judge gestured. "You may read it." My voice stayed calm. "Grace, if you ever doubt your mother, remember she built everything with me. Without her, there would be nothing to inherit." A single gasp echoed from the gallery. Grace's hands flew to her mouth. I set the letter down carefully. "He didn't write that for the lawyers or the press. He wrote it for her, for the day she might forget who I am." The judge took the letter, scanned it quickly, then looked at Grace. "Mrs. Collins, this matches your father's handwriting and signature." Grace didn't speak. Her shoulders shook once, barely visible. Matthew leaned away from her, his face hard and unreadable. The judge cleared his throat. "This document verifies not only intent, but partnership. It supports the validity of the will." He turned to me. "Mrs. Edwards, I believe this case is clear." The gavel came down once. The sound was final, echoing through the room like thunder. The court rules in favor of the defendant. The will stands as written. The words settled into the air. Grace didn't move. Her husband stared straight ahead. Cameras clicked from the gallery, but all I heard was the faint rustle of the flag behind the bench. I gathered my papers quietly. As I stood, the judge looked up again. "Mrs. Edwards," he said, voice low but certain, "it's an honor to have you in my courtroom." Our eyes met. He gave a small nod, the same one Robert once gave me after our first big victory decades ago. I turned to leave. Grace still hadn't looked up. For a moment, I stopped beside her. The smell of her perfume, the same one I used to buy her every Christmas, lingered faintly in the air. "I never wanted your share," I said softly. "I only wanted your respect." She didn't answer. Outside, the sky had cleared again. Reporters shouted, cameras flashed, questions filled the air. I didn't say a word. I walked straight through them, through the sunlight spilling across the courthouse steps. When I reached the car, I looked back once. Through the glass doors, I could see Grace still sitting there, small and still, surrounded by everything she thought she deserved. I opened the car door, slid inside, and closed it behind me. The world outside muffled into silence. My hands rested in my lap. For the first time in years, they didn't tremble. Robert's letter lay beside me on the seat. I looked at it once more and smiled. "They never knew who I really was," I whispered. Then I started the engine and drove home. The drive home was quiet. The sky had turned a pale shade of gold, the kind of light that made every street look softer than it really was. I kept both hands on the wheel, the folded letter resting on the passenger seat beside me. The courthouse was miles behind, but the echoes of the gavel still rang faintly in my chest. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. Just steady. When I reached the gate, the house looked smaller than I remembered. The grass was long. The shutters needed paint. It was the same home where Grace learned to walk, where Robert and I had celebrated every milestone that mattered. I unlocked the door and stepped into the quiet. It greeted me like an old friend, familiar, patient, and honest. I made tea instead of coffee that evening. The steam curled up into the air, soft and slow. The news was already on the television in the other room. I didn't need to look. I could hear the headline clearly. Court rules in favor of widow in millionaire estate case. My name filled the air for a moment before fading under a new story. That's how the world worked. Quick to feed, quicker to forget. On the counter lay a stack of unopened mail. Bills. Advertisements. A letter from the local historical society asking if I would consider donating Robert's old journals for their archive. I smiled. Maybe I would. Maybe some stories deserve to live beyond the people who tried to erase them. The phone rang once, sharp against the quiet. I let it ring again, and again. Finally I picked up. Silence on the other end. Then a small voice. "Mom?" It was Grace. Her tone was soft, uncertain, the kind of voice you use when you're not sure you're allowed to speak. "I saw you on the news," she said. "I didn't know about the letter." I closed my eyes. "You never asked." A pause. "I didn't want to believe you built everything. I thought Dad just gave it all to you." "Robert never gave me anything," I said quietly. "We earned it together, the same way we raised you." She didn't answer right away. I could hear her breathing, faint and uneven. "I don't know how to fix this," she said finally. "Maybe it's not something to fix," I replied. "Maybe it's something to understand." There was another pause. "Can I come by?" The question hung there for a moment. The part of me that used to say yes to everything hesitated. But then I looked at the empty chair across the kitchen table, the one where she used to sit and tell me about her day when she was 12, barefoot eating cookies straight off the tray. "Yes," I said. "Tomorrow." After I hung up, I stood there for a long time, listening to the clock tick. The sound was steady, alive. It had been years since I'd heard her voice without bitterness. Maybe time hadn't taken everything after all. That night I sat in Robert's chair, the same one by the window. The moonlight fell across the floor in narrow bands. I opened one of his old notebooks, the ones full of half-finished plans and sketches of machines he wanted to build but never did. In the corner of one page, in his looping handwriting, he'd written, "For Alice, because she never quits." I closed the book, smiling through the ache in my chest. The next morning, the sun rose clear. I baked a small loaf of bread, the way Grace liked when she was a child, sweetened with honey instead of sugar. I wasn't sure she'd remember, but I did. The smell filled the kitchen, and for a moment it felt like years ago, before money, before lawsuits, before the word inheritance replaced the word family. Around 10, her car pulled into the driveway. I didn't rush to the door. I waited until she knocked. When I opened it, she looked smaller somehow, her eyes swollen from lack of sleep. She didn't speak. Neither did I. She stepped inside, glancing around the house as if seeing it for the first time. "It looks the same," she said softly. "Things only change when people do," I replied. She nodded, her gaze falling on the table. "Is that?" "Your favorite," I said. "Still warm." We sat across from each other. The silence wasn't heavy this time, just full. She tore off a piece of bread and smiled faintly. I thought I'd forgotten this taste. "Some things don't go away that easily," I said. Minutes passed, quiet but alive. She finally spoke again, her eyes down. "I was wrong, Mom, about everything. I thought I was protecting Dad's legacy, but really, I was protecting my pride." I reached across the table, covering her hand with mine. "Your father would have forgiven you long before today. So will I." Her fingers tightened slightly, then relaxed. A single tear slid down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. We stayed like that for a while, hands joined across old wood, the years between us thinning. I didn't need an apology, and she didn't need permission. Just silence. Just truth. When she left later that afternoon, she hugged me before walking to her car. The gesture was small, hesitant, but real. After she drove away, I stood at the doorway, the breeze lifting the curtains behind me. For the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel empty. I looked at Robert's picture on the mantel and whispered, "It's over." And it was. Not the kind of ending with applause or revenge, but the kind that leaves room for something softer. Outside, the roses were blooming again. The wind carried their scent through the open window. I picked one, just one, and set it beside his photo. Peace isn't loud, it's quiet, and it waits. A week passed before I saw Grace again. The air had turned warmer, the kind of warmth that made the curtains sway lazily in the afternoon. The garden had begun to bloom again, each rosebud a quiet reminder that life moves forward whether you're ready or not. I spent the mornings watering them, the evenings sitting by the same window with Robert's old notebooks spread across the table. The house didn't echo the way it used to. Silence had changed its tone. It no longer felt lonely. It just felt earned. Grace started calling every few days. Small things at first. "Did you eat, or do you need groceries?" I answered simply. Our conversations were short but steady, like two people relearning a language they'd once spoken fluently. It wasn't affection yet, but it wasn't anger either. It was something in between, fragile, but alive. One afternoon, she called to say she wanted to help me sort through Robert's papers. "If that's okay," she added quickly. I could hear the hesitation in her voice, the same insecurity that used to hide under her confidence. "Of course," I said. "Bring coffee." She arrived with 2 cups and a small bouquet of daisies. She set them on the table like a peace offering. We worked in silence for a while, going through files that smelled faintly of dust and ink. Every so often, she'd find something, a photograph, a letter, an old invoice, and ask a question. Not about money this time, but about memories. "Was this the first factory?" she asked, holding up a black and white photo. "Yes," I said. "Robert and I painted the walls ourselves. We couldn't afford workers back then." She studied the photo quietly. "I never realized you were there from the beginning." "You weren't supposed to," I replied. "That was the point. We wanted you to grow up without worrying about work, without carrying the weight of it." Her eyes softened. And instead, I turned that into resentment. I didn't answer. Some truths didn't need confirmation. By evening, the table was covered with stacks of organized papers. Grace leaned back in her chair, exhausted but peaceful. "You know," she said, "I keep thinking about that letter Dad wrote. It sounded like he knew this would happen." "He did," I said simply. "He knew people forget the quiet ones first." She nodded slowly. "I think I forgot you long before the will." There was nothing to say after that. She reached across the table, touching my hand lightly. It wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. That was enough. A few days later, a reporter showed up at my door. She was young, with too much energy and not enough sense to be afraid of being rude. "Mrs. Edwards, could I get a statement about the court case?" "People are calling you the widow who outsmarted her daughter." I almost laughed. "That's not the story," I said. "Then what is?" she asked. "It's not about outsmarting anyone. It's about remembering who you are when everyone else forgets." She blinked, unsure how to respond, then scribbled something in her notebook. When she left, I closed the door gently. Titles, headlines, they came and went. The truth stayed quiet, steady, patient. That evening, I walked through the garden again. The sun was low, and the light painted everything gold. Grace arrived unannounced, carrying a photo frame. "I thought you should have this," she said, handing it to me. It was a picture of the three of us, Robert, me, and Grace, at her college graduation. Robert's arm was around her shoulders, his other hand holding mine. We all looked so alive, so certain. "I found it in an old album," she said. "I think Dad would have wanted it here." I set it on the mantel beside Robert's photo. "He would have," I said softly. She stayed for dinner. We didn't talk about the case, or the inheritance, or the years we'd lost. We talked about ordinary things, recipes, neighbors, the weather. When she left, she hugged me again, tighter this time, like she meant it. After she drove away, I sat outside on the porch with my tea. The air was cool, the sky turning violet. I thought about all the versions of myself that had lived in this house, the young wife full of dreams, the mother learning patience, the widow learning silence. And now this woman, older, still standing, still here. The world would remember me as the woman who won in court. But that wasn't the victory. The victory was that I hadn't let the bitterness consume me. I had chosen stillness over revenge, truth over noise. Inside, the clock chimed 7. I turned off the porch light and locked the door. The house felt safe again. On the kitchen table, the bouquet of daisies had begun to wilt, their petals softening, leaning toward the window where the moonlight touched them gently. I picked one up and pressed it between the pages of Robert's notebook. The ink had faded on the page, but his handwriting still glowed faintly in the dim light. "For Alice, because she never quits." I whispered the words to myself. Then I closed the book. Tomorrow, the world would wake up and move on. But I had already found what I was looking for. A quiet place where truth didn't need to shout to be heard. I turned off the lights, walked upstairs, and stopped at the doorway of the empty room that used to be Grace's. The window was open, and the curtain moved with the wind. I smiled. Maybe someday she'd come back to stay for a while. Maybe not. Either way, I'd be ready. Downstairs, the clock ticked softly, each sound a promise that life would keep moving. I took one last look at the framed photo by the mantel, whispered good night, and climbed the stairs, leaving the lights low and the world peaceful once again. The days began to stretch quietly after that. I woke up earlier than usual, drawn by the stillness of mornings that no longer carried weight. The house seemed to breathe again. I kept the radio on low, soft old songs filling the rooms where once only silence lived. Every day felt the same, and that sameness was a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. Grace called more often now. Sometimes she came over just to sit in the garden, her shoes sinking into the damp soil as she watered the roses. She didn't talk much, and neither did I. Words weren't needed. Time was doing the speaking for us. We were mending something invisible, not through confessions or apologies, but through the simple act of showing up. One afternoon, she brought an old wooden box she'd found in her attic. "It's full of Dad's old photographs," she said, setting it on the table. The box was dusty, the hinges stiff. We opened it together. Inside were pictures from before she was born, Robert in his workshop, me standing beside him in overalls, our hands stained with paint and grease. Grace traced the edges of the photos with her fingertips. "I don't remember him like this," she said softly. "That's because you met him after we stopped struggling," I replied. "He was gentler then, but the fight never really left him." She smiled faintly. "I see now where I got it." We sorted the photographs into neat piles. Early years, the company's beginning, family trips, holidays. She found a picture of herself at 7, wearing a red coat, holding a snow globe. Robert had bought her in Chicago. "He said I'd travel the world one day," she said, her voice small. "He believed you would," I said. "I thought I already did," she whispered. The next morning, she came over again, this time with breakfast. Pancakes, just like I used to make when she was in school. The kitchen filled with warmth and the smell of butter. I watched her move around the counters, comfortable in a space she'd avoided for years. "You remembered how to make them," I said. I wrote it down when I was 16, she replied. In case you ever stopped cooking for me. I didn't stop, I said. You just stopped coming. She paused, spatula in hand, then nodded. I know. We ate together at the small table by the window. The morning light touched her face, softer now, older. She didn't look like the woman from the courtroom anymore. She looked like my daughter again. After breakfast, I walked her to the door. She hugged me longer this time. No hesitation, no guilt. Just quiet understanding. You're stronger than anyone I know, she said before leaving. I smiled. I've had practice. When the door closed behind her, I stood for a while, letting the warmth linger in the room. The air smelled faintly of maple syrup and old memories. That evening, I found a letter slipped under my door. No return address, just my name written in Grace's handwriting. I opened it slowly. Mom, I keep thinking about everything you said, about how truth doesn't need to shout. I used to think power came from having the last word, but I see now it comes from standing still when everyone else rushes to speak. You did that, and somehow that silence spoke louder than anything I ever said. I love you. Grace. I folded the letter carefully and placed it next to Robert's photo. For a moment, I could almost hear his laugh again, low and warm. I whispered, she's finding her way back. Days slipped into weeks. The newspaper stopped calling. The headlines faded. The world moved on. But something new had taken root here, something I hadn't dared hope for. One Saturday morning, Grace arrived unannounced, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a thick envelope. I've been talking to a friend, she said. He works at the community center. They need help teaching small business classes, older women starting over after losing their spouses. I raised an eyebrow. And you think I'd fit in with that crowd? She laughed. I think you'd teach them more than anyone else could. I looked at the envelope, then back at her. You're serious. As serious as you were in that courtroom, she said. I thought about it for a moment, the idea settling in like a seed. Maybe I'll visit, I said. A week later, I did. The community center was small, the floors worn, the paint chipped. But the people, mostly women in their 50s and 60s, were bright-eyed and eager, clutching notebooks, waiting to learn. They recognized me instantly. Some had watched the case on the news. Is it true you built the company with your husband? One woman asked. Yes, I said simply. And it's true I almost lost myself in it too. I spent the afternoon sharing stories, not about money, but about survival, patience, and dignity. About how silence, when used right, could be the sharpest weapon of all. When I left, the sun was low, the light turning everything gold again. I drove home with the windows down, the air warm and alive. The house waited for me, like an old friend. Inside, the daisies Grace had brought weeks ago had dried, their stems brittle but still standing tall in the vase. I didn't throw them away. Some things deserve to stay, even after their season passed. That night, I wrote a short note and tucked it inside Robert's notebook. We kept our promise. She came home. I closed the cover and set it back on the shelf. Then I turned off the lights, walked upstairs, and stood at the window, looking out into the quiet garden below. The moonlight brushed the roses, soft and silver. For the first time in a long time, everything felt whole. Spring arrived quietly that year. The air carried the scent of lilac, and the mornings began with birds instead of silence. I woke before dawn most days, sitting by the kitchen window with my tea, watching light fill the edges of the garden. The roses had started to bud again, their stems heavy from the rain. Every season brought its work, and this one brought peace that stayed. Grace kept visiting. Sometimes she came after work, still in her uniform, tired but smiling. Other times she brought her husband, though he mostly stood near the car, unsure how to act around me. She didn't push him to come inside. That told me she'd learned something about control, about silence, about strength. I didn't need an apology from him. He'd already seen what pride looked like when it broke. We fell into a rhythm. She'd bring groceries or small gifts I didn't need. I'd cook simple meals, roasted vegetables, warm soup, fresh bread. It wasn't about the food. It was about rebuilding something that had almost died. Every shared meal stitched a thread back where there had once been distance. One evening after dinner, Grace lingered in the doorway. The sun had already set, leaving only a faint amber line behind the trees. She looked older than her years, but softer, calmer. "Do you ever miss the company?" she asked. I thought for a moment. Sometimes, I said. Not the work, the purpose. It gave our days shape. She nodded. I think I understand that now. You will, I said. Purpose doesn't retire. It just changes its form. The next week, I went back to the community center. The women I'd met before were waiting with notebooks and coffee cups. They greeted me with small smiles and stories about their progress. One had started selling handmade quilts. Another had opened a small cleaning business. Their pride reminded me of myself at 40, full of grit, not yet softened by time. After the session ended, one of them approached me. Mrs. Edwards, she said, I watched your trial on television. You didn't say much back then, but when you did, people listened. I smiled. That's because power doesn't live in volume, I said. It lives in clarity. She nodded like she'd just learned something she'd never forget. That night, I drove home under a sky full of stars. The house was dark, but not lonely. Grace had left a note on the table, her handwriting round and familiar. Stopped by. Left you some soup in the fridge. Love you, Mom. It was simple, but it made me smile. For years, she'd signed letters with her name. Now she'd used love. It was a small thing, but small things were what made life gentle again. The following Sunday, I was invited to speak at a local charity luncheon. They wanted me to tell my story, the one where the mother wins against her daughter, the organizer said. I declined the title, but agreed to speak. It wasn't a story about winning. It was a story about remembering. The room was full of women my age, widows, mothers, grandmothers, each carrying her own quiet heartbreak. When I walked to the podium, the microphone squeaked slightly. I waited for the sound to fade before speaking. I was never brave, I began. I was just tired of pretending to be small. A hush fell across the room. I spent most of my life standing behind someone else's name. My husband's, my company's, even my daughter's. But one day, the world forced me to stand behind my own. That day didn't destroy me. It revealed me. I looked around the room, faces nodding, some tearful, some smiling softly. If you've been forgotten, I said, remember this. Silence is not weakness. It's the sound of strength waiting for its moment. When I finished, there was no applause at first, only the sound of chairs shifting, a collective breath being held. Then they stood, not for victory, but for understanding. Afterward, a woman approached me, clutching my hand. You gave me hope, she said. I thought I was too old to start over. You're not, I told her. None of us are. By the time I got home, the sky was dark again. Grace's car was parked in the driveway. She was sitting on the porch, a cup of tea in her hand. You were wonderful, she said. You were there? I sat in the back, she admitted. Didn't want to distract you. You wouldn't have, I said. You're the reason I spoke. She smiled. I'm proud of you, Mom. I reached over and squeezed her hand. I'm proud of you, too. We sat in silence, the kind that felt full rather than empty. The crickets sang somewhere in the dark. The air smelled like cut grass and home. When she left that night, she kissed my cheek before going to her car. I watched her taillights fade into the distance until the road went quiet again. Inside, I poured myself one last cup of tea. I stood at the window, looking out at the roses swaying under the moonlight. They had survived the storms, the neglect, the cold, and still they bloomed. I whispered softly, we made it. The house, the garden, the night, everything seemed to nod back in agreement. Summer came quietly, the kind that crept in without warning. The air grew heavy with the smell of cut grass and warm rain. Every morning, sunlight spilled through the lace curtains, painting soft patterns on the wooden floor. I had grown used to the stillness, to waking early, to tea cooling beside me as the world outside began its day. There was no chaos left, no courtroom, no whispers. Just life, moving forward in its gentle way. Grace came by one morning with a small box in her hands. I brought something, she said. The box was plain, tied with an old ribbon. She set it on the table, looking almost shy. Dad kept this in his office. I found it behind a drawer. Inside were small keepsakes, a pocket watch, a set of cufflinks, and an old photograph of us standing in front of the factory. On the back, Robert had written in his neat handwriting, "The beginning. Together." I touched the edge of the picture and smiled. He always wrote things like that, I said. Grace nodded. He did. I guess I didn't realize what he meant until now. We sat for a while without talking, the morning light touching everything softly. It was strange how peace had replaced the ache that used to live in this house. The past was still there, but it no longer demanded attention. It had settled, like dust on an old bookshelf, present, but no longer heavy. After Grace left, I decided to clean the study. The same room that had once been Robert's, the room that started everything. I hadn't touched it since the trial. The shelves were lined with ledgers, notebooks, and old photos. His desk was still sturdy, still full of small marks and scratches from years of use. I opened one drawer and found a small notebook labeled Plans for Alice. Inside were pages of half-written ideas, sketches for things he never built, and a list of dates and names. But at the very end, in his handwriting, there were only 2 words. Thank you. I closed the notebook carefully, my throat tight. Even in silence, he'd left me words that mattered. That afternoon I walked to the garden. The roses were blooming fuller than I'd ever seen them, thick and bright against the green. I spent hours trimming them, my gloves damp from the dew. The sun was warm on my back, and for the first time in years, I felt light. When evening came, I sat on the porch with a glass of lemonade, listening to the hum of the cicadas. Grace called again. "I'm thinking of coming by this weekend," she said. "I want to bring Matthew. He wants to apologize properly." I looked out at the fading sky, its colors soft and forgiving. "That would be fine," I said. "We'll have dinner in the garden." Saturday came with golden light and the sound of birds. Grace arrived first, carrying groceries. Matthew followed quietly behind her, his steps hesitant. He looked older than I remembered. Thinner, humbled. "Thank you for letting me come," he said. I nodded. "You're welcome." He didn't try to explain or defend himself. He just helped set the table under the oak tree. Grace cooked while I arranged flowers in a vase. The 3 of us ate together, the air filled with the sounds of crickets and wind. No one mentioned the trial. No one mentioned money. We talked about Grace's work, about the community center, about the world outside our own stories. When dinner ended, Matthew stood and said, "I owe you more than an apology." "You don't owe me anything," I said. "Just be good to her, that's all." He nodded, eyes glistening. "I will." After they left that night, I stayed outside long after the dishes were cleared. The moon was rising behind the trees, and the garden glowed faintly in its light. I thought about how strange life could be, how it could shatter and then mend itself again in ways you never expected. Inside, the phone rang once. It was the director from the community center. "Mrs. Edwards," she said, "the women from your class want to start a program in your name. They said you inspired them." I smiled. "What kind of program?" "A mentorship group," she said. "For widows, for women rebuilding their lives." I didn't answer right away. The idea felt bigger than me, but also right. "Tell them yes," I said. "If they're willing, I'll come by next week." When the call ended, I walked upstairs and opened the window of my room. The night air smelled of rain and earth. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled softly. Not a warning, just a reminder that even peace carried sound. I sat by the window, holding the photograph Grace had brought earlier. The 3 of us, younger, smiling, unaware of how much time would change everything. I traced the outline of our faces with my thumb and whispered, "Together still." Below, the garden swayed in the wind, petals scattering across the grass. The house creaked gently, alive in its quiet. Before turning out the light, I placed the photo beside Robert's notebook on the nightstand. 2 lives, one finished, one still unfolding. Outside, the first drops of summer rain began to fall, tapping softly against the glass. The sound was steady, familiar. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like life, continuing exactly as it should. The following week came with the sound of rain and the smell of wet earth. I woke early, the way I always did, and sat at the table with my tea. The newspaper lay unopened beside me. Headlines no longer mattered. The world had found new stories to chase. Mine had already become old news. I liked it that way. Quiet suited me. By mid-morning, the clouds began to part, and sunlight slipped through the kitchen window. Grace called, her voice bright for the first time in years. "Mom, are you ready for the meeting at the center?" "I've been ready for years," I said, smiling. She laughed softly. "I'll pick you up in an hour." When she arrived, she looked different, lighter somehow. The heaviness that used to follow her, the pride, the defensiveness, had softened into something almost gentle. She'd cut her hair short, and it framed her face the way it used to when she was young. "You look happy," I said. "I am," she replied. "Thanks to you." The community center was bustling when we arrived. The women from my class had gathered near the back, their faces glowing with excitement. On the wall behind them hung a banner that read, "The Alice Edwards Initiative, Rebuilding Lives with Grace." I froze for a moment, staring at it. Grace slipped her arm through mine. "They named it after both of us," she whispered. I didn't speak. My throat felt tight. One of the women, a petite grandmother named June, stood up and said, "Mrs. Edwards, we wanted to thank you for showing us that life doesn't stop when people stop believing in us." I smiled. "It never does," I said. "We just have to remember we were strong before they ever doubted us." The room filled with soft applause. I looked at Grace, who was blinking back tears. For a moment, time folded in on itself. The courtroom, the years of silence, the sharp words, all of it fading into something smaller, something forgivable. After the meeting, we stayed to help clean up. Grace stacked chairs while I folded the banner. "You've done something good here," I told her. She looked down. "I didn't do this alone." "You never had to," I said. On the drive home, we passed the old factory, now converted into a local art space. The brick walls were the same, the sign still faintly showing the company name that Robert and I had painted decades ago. Grace slowed the car. "You built all this," she said softly. "We built it," I corrected her. "Your father and I. And now it's yours to remember, not to carry." That night, she stayed for dinner again. We cooked together, laughing over burnt bread and spilled flour. It felt easy, natural. We didn't need to fill the silence anymore. It had become our comfort. After she left, I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders. The sky was dark, the stars sharp against the black. A soft wind rustled through the garden. The roses had begun to fade, their petals falling one by one. But even in their decline, they were beautiful. They reminded me of everything that had passed. Love, loss, forgiveness. All of it still living in the same soil. The next morning, I received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Inside was an invitation from the city council. They wanted to honor me for my contribution to women's empowerment and community resilience. I laughed out loud, the sound echoing through the empty kitchen. Recognition had come again, but this time it didn't sting. I folded the letter and tucked it inside Robert's notebook. He would have found the whole thing amusing. Later that day, Grace stopped by with Matthew. He stood in the doorway, hesitant, holding a small gift bag. "This is from both of us," he said. Inside was a silver frame. The photograph inside showed Grace and me at the community center, smiling under the banner. For once, it didn't look like a staged picture. It looked real. "It's beautiful," I said. Matthew nodded. "I wanted to say thank you," he added, "for forgiving us, for not giving up on her." I smiled faintly. "You both had to lose a lot to find what mattered. That's the price for truth sometimes." He nodded, eyes low, and for the first time I saw sincerity in him. Grace slipped her hand into his, and I felt something ease inside me. That evening, after they left, I took the photo and placed it beside Robert's. 2 frames, one of the beginning, one of the now. Between them, a lifetime. As night fell, thunder rumbled softly in the distance, the promise of another summer storm. I didn't close the window this time. I liked the sound, the rhythm of rain against glass, the way it filled the house without breaking the calm. I thought of all the versions of myself that had lived here. The wife, the mother, the widow, the woman on trial, the teacher, the survivor. They all existed together now, layered like the rings of a tree. When the power flickered briefly, I lit a candle on the table. Its flame reflected off the framed photographs, soft and golden. For a long moment, I just watched it burn. I whispered, "We kept our promise, Robert. She's home." The rain grew heavier, drumming against the roof. I didn't move. The world outside could change as much as it wanted. I had already arrived at peace. The storm passed during the night, leaving the air clean and cool. When I opened the curtains in the morning, sunlight poured in, touching everything it could reach. The framed photos, the table, the roses bending slightly outside the window. I stood there for a long time, letting the light find me. It felt like a blessing. Grace called after breakfast. Her voice sounded bright. "Mom, the center wants you to come next weekend. They're planning something for you." "What kind of something?" I asked. She laughed. "A surprise. And before you say you don't like surprises, you're not allowed to say no. I wasn't planning to, I said softly. Just tell me what to wear. Something you love, she said. That afternoon, I walked through the garden, pruning the roses that had survived the storm. Their petals were still damp, glistening under the sun. I thought about how delicate they looked and how strong they actually were, how they endured wind, rain, and time, and still found the courage to bloom again. The following weekend arrived faster than I expected. Grace came early, helping me choose a dress. It was simple, light blue, one Robert had given me years ago. It still fits, she said, smiling. It was made well, I replied. She drove while I watched the city roll by outside the window. The streets were familiar, but quieter than I remembered. The community center looked different that day. Freshly painted, filled with laughter and voices. A banner hung near the entrance, a celebration of resilience. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and flowers. The women I had taught stood waiting, each one holding a single rose. They greeted me with warm smiles and gentle applause. Grace led me to the front of the room. "Mom," she said softly, "we wanted to thank you. Not for teaching us about business or money, but for showing us how to start again." One of the women stepped forward, holding a plaque engraved with my name. Beneath it, the words read, "For strength in silence and kindness in victory." I didn't say much. Just thanked them, my voice quieter than usual. I wasn't used to standing in front of people anymore, but looking out at their faces, women who had all lost something and built it back piece by piece, I realized this was what I'd been working toward all along. Not legacy, not recognition, just continuation. After the event, Grace and I sat outside on a bench near the garden behind the building. Children were playing nearby, their laughter sharp and bright in the afternoon air. She turned to me. "You know," she said, "when I first filed that lawsuit, I thought I was fighting for what was mine. I didn't realize I was fighting against what made me." I looked at her, the same girl who used to hide behind my skirts when she was small. "You've learned more than I ever could have taught you," I said. She smiled faintly. "You taught me anyway, just took me longer to listen." We sat in silence for a while, the kind that felt full, not empty. Then she leaned her head against my shoulder like she hadn't done in decades. "Do you think Dad would be proud of us?" she asked. "I think he already was," I said. Later, at home, I set the plaque on the mantel beside Robert's photo and the letter he wrote before he died. The three things together looked complete. His words, my work, and the proof that life kept moving even after everything else had stopped. As evening fell, Grace called again. "I forgot to tell you," she said. "Matthew wants to donate to the center in your name. He said it's the least he can do." "That's kind of him," I said. She paused. "You really forgive us, don't you?" "I already did," I said, the day I walked out of that courtroom. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then she said softly, "I love you, Mom." I smiled, the kind of smile that comes from deep inside. "I love you too, Grace." After we hung up, I stepped outside. The air was cool, the sky streaked with orange and gold. I walked down the porch steps barefoot, feeling the damp earth beneath my feet. The roses were swaying gently, heavy with new blooms. I picked one, the softest pink, and held it close to my face. It smelled of rain and sunlight and everything that had come before. I whispered to the quiet air, "We did it, Robert." Inside, the clock chimed 7. The light in the living room was warm, the kind of light that makes you forget every dark night you've ever known. I sat by the window again, my tea cooling beside me, and watched the last bit of daylight fade. For once, I didn't think about the past. I didn't think about what had been lost or what could still go wrong. I just sat there, feeling the weight of peace settle over me. Outside, the garden breathed in rhythm with the wind. The petals moved like they were nodding, agreeing with the silence. And in that silence, I realized something simple. The story wasn't about what I'd won. It was about what I'd kept. Kindness, dignity, grace. When the night finally arrived, I turned off the lights and whispered one last good night, not to anyone in particular, but to everything that had brought me here. The sound of the house settling around me felt like a sigh. And for the first time in a long time, I slept without dreams. Morning came soft and gold. I woke to the sound of birds outside my window, their song threading through the quiet like a promise. The house felt warm, filled with the kind of silence that didn't ache anymore. I stayed in bed for a while, listening, letting it sink in. There was no rush. Peace never asks you to hurry. When I finally got up, the sunlight followed me into the kitchen. I made tea, poured it into my favorite cup, the one with the tiny chip on the rim, and sat by the window. Outside, the roses shimmered with dew. They had survived another storm. So had I. Grace called mid-morning. Her voice was gentle, unhurried. "Mom, I was thinking about coming over later. Maybe we could go for a walk by the lake?" "That sounds lovely," I said. "Bring your jacket. It might be chilly." She laughed. "You'll always be my reminder to wear one." After we hung up, I looked around the house, the walls lined with photos, the books, the memories tucked into every corner. Each mark and scratch had a story. Every room carried a piece of the woman I had been. The young wife who dreamed big, the mother who gave everything, the widow who lost it all, and the woman who found her own name again. All of them lived here together, quietly. I went out to the garden before Grace arrived. The soil was damp, rich, alive. I knelt beside the rosebush Robert had planted for me on our 20th anniversary. Its blooms had deepened in color over the years, darker, stronger, more certain. I trimmed a few stems and set them in a small vase for the kitchen table. The scent filled the air, sweet and familiar. By afternoon, Grace's car pulled into the driveway. She waved from the window like she used to when she was little. When she stepped out, she carried a small paper bag. "Fresh bread," she said. "I stopped by that bakery you love." We walked together down the old path toward the lake. The water shimmered under the sun, calm and endless. The same lake where we used to picnic when she was a child, when Robert would skip stones and she'd chase the ripples. Grace took my arm as we walked. "Do you ever think about him?" she asked. "Every day," I said, "but not with sadness anymore, just gratitude." She smiled. "I think he'd be proud of us." "I think he already is," I said. We sat on the bench by the water, the same one that had been there for decades. A light breeze brushed across the surface, scattering reflections like pieces of glass. Grace leaned her head on my shoulder. I felt the warmth of her hand resting over mine. It fit perfectly the way it used to. For a long while, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The world around us spoke enough. The rustle of leaves, the soft call of a bird, the rhythm of water meeting shore. Everything felt in place. When the sun began to dip lower, painting the lake in shades of amber and rose, Grace turned to me. "Do you ever wish things had been different?" I thought for a moment, then shook my head. "No," I said. "If it hadn't happened the way it did, I wouldn't know who I am now. And you wouldn't either." She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "You taught me that strength doesn't always have to shout." I smiled. "It rarely needs to." We walked back home as the sky turned violet. The porch light glowed faintly against the twilight. Grace stayed for dinner, and afterward we sat by the fireplace even though the air was warm. She told me about work, about her plans to help expand the community center's program. I listened, proud and quiet, the way mothers do when they finally see their children become the people they were always meant to be. When it was time for her to leave, she hugged me tightly. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said. "I'll be here," I replied. After she drove away, I went back to the kitchen and washed the dishes slowly. The house was still but not empty. I could feel Robert everywhere, in the creak of the floorboards, in the soft ticking of the clock, in the laughter that lingered like perfume in the air. I walked to the mantel and touched the plaque from the community center, the letter, and the photos lined neatly beside it. "We did it," I whispered. "We all made it home." Then I opened the back door. The night air was cool and smelled of earth and roses. I stepped outside barefoot, the grass damp beneath my feet. The moon hung low, round and silver, watching quietly. The garden swayed, alive with color and memory. I stood there for a long time, breathing it all in. The sound of crickets, the distant echo of water, the faint hum of the world carrying on. Everything was where it belonged. In that quiet, I finally understood something simple and whole. Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It just makes room for love to live again. I went back inside, turned off the lights, and sat in Robert's old chair one last time before bed. The candle on the table flickered, its flame steady. I closed my eyes and let the warmth settle around me. Tomorrow would come like every day before it, slow, certain, kind. And as I drifted towards sleep, I whispered to the dark, to the house, to the life I'd built and rebuilt. They thought I was just a housewife. They never knew who I really was.